Welcome to the Donna Sebo Show Special Editions. This program is dedicated to featuring authors and experts from around the world who will share their knowledge and insight with you. The viewing and listening audience, literacy and education are the keys to freedom, and diversity enables one to live in a world with broader perspectives. This is Donna Sebo, and I will be your host for the next hour.
Hello and welcome to the Donna Sebo Show Special Editions. I'm delighted to spend this time with you along with two very, very special guests. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with my programming, I have a daily radio show, the Donna Sebo Show, and also a program called Warriors for Peace. And you can find out about that by going to my website, delphiinternational.com. Today, we are going to be having a discussion about military history. Now, both of my guests are authors. They have written both in a nonfiction format as well as a fiction format. If you have a desire to write, and if history fascinates you, I think you're going to find our conversations very interesting. And more than that, you'll have an opportunity to see the publications so that if you should decide you would like to check them out and add them to your library, well, they're there for your visual pleasure. I want to introduce both of my guests. My first guest is retired Major General Chris Adams, here with the United States Air Force. Now, he was the former Chief of Staff of the Strategic Air Command, also formerly was the director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and he's been an industrial executive. He also flew the B-52 bombers, and he traveled extensively in the former Soviet states, making some 23 visits over a 5-year period in the 1990s. He's a veteran of the Cold War, including Vietnam. He served 31 years in the United States Air Force, including 3 years with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and 6 years with the Defense Nuclear Agency. He has been awarded the nation's highest peacetime decoration, the United States Distinguished Service Medal. He's also been given a number of other awards and decorations. Now, he is a man that has an extensive background that I think has, well, it's been very, very interesting because he's been a guest on my programs, my radio show programs, multiple times. My other guest is Helena Shrader. She is a former United States diplomat. She obtained her PhD in modern history from the University of Hamburg. She spent, interestingly enough, well, a third of her life in Berlin. And she has become very, very much renowned for her wonderful publication called The Blockade Breakers, dealing with the Berlin airlift. And I find many people don't know anything about the Berlin airlift, so you're going to get an education about that. She's written a lot of novels about historical fiction. She's won multiple literary awards and so many accolades for her work and her accuracy in doing the research on historical information that's featured both in her novels of historical, relevancy and also in her nonfiction publications. And right now she's working on a trilogy. Book number 3 is going to be coming out. We'll be talking about that. And one of the most important points with both of my authors is that they acknowledge the men and women who served in that time frame, not just the Cold War, but even before the Cold War started. And we also like to give them the acknowledgement and the notice of appreciation for them enabling us to have the freedoms that we have today. I want to welcome both of you. Helena, you are in Greece, and because of the novelty and the wonder of Zoom, here we are. And you're a lover of books. I can see from your background, you have just as
Yes, true.
just as many books as I have. It's such a delight to finally meet you in person after the many conversations that we've had.
Donna, it's delight. It's delight being here, Donna. It's really great. Thank you.
You know, Helena, the books that you've written have covered so many aspects of personal relationships, the military interactions, of what occurred, previous to the Cold War. And you've written about women who fly and who, in a time frame where women were not given an opportunity, as far as the United States was concerned. It wasn't that way with the Russians or the English or the French necessarily, but it was with us here. So you have this phenomenal background. How did you start writing? I mean, what made you decide that this was going to be your genre?
Donna, that's a that's a long that's a there's only a long answer to that. I'll try to keep it short. It really goes back to when I was a child, and I was 4 years old. We went to Rome. I'll try to keep this short. And my father wisely thought this 4-year-old is going to drive all the rest of the people on the tour crazy. So she told my father to take me through the Colosseum on my own. And my father said just one thing. He said, "This is where they fed Christians to the lions." And literally from that, I started wandering through, where were the lions and and why couldn't they escape? And why couldn't they get away? And that started it all. I started looking at the world and at history through the eyes of what would it have been like to be there and live there. And yes, obviously, there's many phases between that 4-year-old and the Colosseum and that wonder that to my books, my research books, my PhD in history. But that's the spark of that desire to write about different times.
Now, is it because of your dad that you ended up living in Berlin for a third of your life? No.
No, no. My father was a professor of actually industrial engineering. With him, I was in Japan and Brazil and the UK. I went back to Berlin on my own. I got interested while I was in university in the German resistance to Hitler. And one of these things that, I'd grown up on the myth. My mother was Danish, and that, the Danish resistance, the French resistance, we've all Yugoslav resistance and all of that, but they were fighting a foreign invader. And when I was confronted during my actually it was a master's degree in history at the University of Kentucky with the fact that Germany had their own resistance, it immediately attracted me, because that's not a resistance against a foreign invader. That is qualitatively different. That's a moral resistance. These are people willing to say that it's not my country, right or wrong. If my country is this wrong, I have to commit treason for the sake of humanity. And I went to Berlin to follow in pursuit of a PhD in history. That's my PhD in history, although it was from the University of Hamburg. I resided in Berlin the entire time, and I was working on a dissertation about one of the leading members of the German resistance, General Friedrich Olbricht, and then I stayed. I got stuck in Berlin, the wall came down, I married, and it went on. And it was at the end of that phase that I then transferred to the U.S. Diplomatic Corps. But that Berlin phase came as a result of me pursuing a PhD in Germany on the German resistance to Hitler.
Helena, when people are interested, or they say you're writing the historical novels, I often wonder how, now you got a PhD in modern history. So this enabled you already to have an understanding of how to do research. But if someone wanted to know about how to do research, because I feature on my show authors, and all of you seem to walk through your own journey, with what you do in your research, what is it how do you know how to find out about what it is you're wanting to research? Let me just put it that way. Do you get to know all the librarians, take them chocolate, candy, and flowers to make sure that they help you? I mean, how do you know where to go to get all of the information?
I think, first of all, I had to answer, doing historical research as for a dissertation or for a nonfiction book, fairly straightforward. You can find the primary sources, you can look at basically you find the best secondary sources, and you go through their bibliographies, finding their primary sources and theirs, and you go from the sources to sources. And for my Blockade Breakers, I knew I wanted, because it was about I did a lot of interviews, also for my dissertation, a lot of oral history. I will post messages, I will publish, notifications in journals, magazines, with the Berlin Airlift, it's their association with the German resistance. I actually went to military organizations, to unit organizations, whatever you do, whatever's out there. And I asked people who had lived through the phenomena to contact me. People wrote me, people sent me emails, I did interviews with people who wanted to do it that way. So that's quite straightforward. The problem is writing novels is that you need to know things that aren't part of the historical record and are much harder to track down. So to try to get a short example, I'm writing the book about the women pilots. I need to know, it was very straightforward. I needed to know, how were they recruited, how were they trained, what were their tasks, what were they done, what was the organization in which they worked, or the multiple organizations in which they worked, what were some of the, how was it, how did they end the, were they discharged, how did the organizations get ended. If I'm writing a novel in which a woman pilot appears, to know all of that. I need to know how they were recruited, who they recruited, how they were recruited, what qualifications they had, what their uniforms were like, blah blah blah. All of that stuff that I needed for the history. But I also need to know, what was the music they were listening to? What were the social mores? Were they likely to be going out on dates with multiple people, or did they only go out in groups? Or all of these kinds of, what were the how religious were people in that period? How often did people go to church? Would it have been normal for somebody to be an atheist or not? Mm-hmm. I don't, you get where I'm going. That's hard to research. And I find that the best way to research for novels is to read contemporary. Going back to try to read memoirs, try to read diaries, try to read letters, try to read, again, talk to people who lived, ask them these kinds of questions. What was it like living? Not just, where were you stationed, but when you were stationed there, did you go to the town, meet a lot of locals? Did you stay, or did you just socialize with people from the RATWAF or whatever? In other words, getting those kinds of things requires understanding the atmosphere and the environment in which people live. If you're writing a modern novel, a novel set in the present, you know all that instinctively. You don't have to think about it. It's really easy to write a modern set today. It's there. You know your milieu, you know what you're writing about. When you're writing about history, you have to try to put yourself back in a different period, and you have to realize, again, I'm interrupting myself, but I see so many mistakes in novels, stupid errors, because poor people didn't have a telephone in 1940. So just having somebody pick up a phone and call may be wrong, may be very jarring, if you realize that kind of a poor family wouldn't have had a phone in 1940. Those kinds of things, not to mention the usual sexual mores change rate. That, as I say, it's very hard to research, because it's nobody's out there saying this is wrong. You can't go to Wikipedia, you can't go to an encyclopedia, you can't get some book and say this is the date on which such and such had happened, because these are things that aren't recorded. They're the atmosphere in which the events happen. I hope that makes sense.
Yes. Chris, excuse me. Chris Adams, you're in Austin, Texas, and you are a person that has extensive background in traveling overseas. And when I first met you, and you were on my show, I found that we had a common denominator that was totally unexpected. You were in the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. Your first book was Requiem of a Spy, and that is my first interview that I had with you. And of course, you've written a number of books. But I was in Russia on a business trip with a people-to-people program in 1992. And there was a conversation that started between the two of us that I thought was really very, very special, because you have a strong affiliation with the people in Kiev. And of course, Kiev is very much in the news and has been in the news in, sadly, a very ugly situation for the past couple of years with Russia. There's the war that's going on. But you have been engaged in so much military activity through so many years. And when you were writing Requiem of a Spy, which is an amazing read, you wrote it in a fictitious format. Why did you choose to write it in a fictitious format rather than putting it into a nonfiction format? Because you actually were there. You have been in this environment in the Soviet Union for, well, already a number of years. Why did you choose to do the expression in a fictitious format rather than a nonfiction?
Well, I had already written, I sort of fell into writing by accident, if you will. After I retired, I didn't have anything else to do. It was like hitting a brick wall when I retired from the Air Force and from the government and from my trips in Russia. And so I was challenged by some friends to tell a little bit about what I did and where I did it and what have you. So I scribed out a little 200-page book. The Air Force Air University published it, and it was entitled "Inside the Cold War: A Cold Warrior's Reflections," and it really hit a target with a number of senior military people. I was invited back to Omaha, Nebraska, back in the early 90s to give a book report, which I did to about 4,000 or 5,000 people in downtown Omaha one evening, and it really struck another target, I guess you'd say, including my own in terms of writing. And that encouraged me then to not so much to write a novel, that came later, but I cranked out a couple of documentaries. One which I'm really pleased with. It's if I can remember the name of it, Ideologies in Conflict, really discussing the difference in the ideologies of democracy, the United States of America, the Western part of the world, and then my experience in Russia and Ukraine for those 5 or 6 years I was over there. After that, I decided that's it. I don't need to write anymore. And then I was in Washington one evening, bumped into a friend of mine, a former retired agent. I won't say the agency, but nevertheless, he asked me, he said, I read your Ideologies in Conflict, and I was really interested. He said, have you ever thought about writing something besides a documentary? And I said, well, no, I have to use my experience to what I have to put together the best I know how to do it. And he said, have you ever met Tom Clancy? I said, no, I never have. He said, well, you know, he's a renowned novelist, mystery writer, what have you. And I said, oh yeah, I'm quite familiar with Clancy's writing. So he said, let's have dinner with you one night while you're here. And we did. And I spent about 3 hours with Tom Clancy at dinner there in Washington. And he gave me some advice on how you put things together in a novel form. He said, first of all, documentaries are very dry, very usually uninteresting because people get too buried into little minuscule detail and what have you, and you end up with a book, and that's about it, a book of history. He said, think about writing a novel or two and then see how it turns out for you. Pick your character, develop that character, give him a lifetime experience, raise him up into to an adult or wherever you want to take him, and make him your primary character. So I thought about that for a while, and I met a lot of folks when I was in Russia, Ukraine, and what have you, and I met some very good friends over there. And my best friend I met was Sasha Katsanov. Sasha acted as my translator, interpreter. They're mostly in Russia, not in Ukraine, of course. And so I made Sasha my character, and I began then to develop novels around about things I had experienced. Put a lot of imagination into my thoughts, into my brain, if I had any, and began to develop then Sasha as my primary character. I made him, his father was, fiction-wise, was a retired Soviet general, and Sasha was raised as a young officer, became a spy himself. And that became then the sequence of my 14 or 15 novels in which Sasha is my main character throughout. We go through all sorts of iterations of his life's experience as a spy. And I will say this with regard to writing novels, I'm sure Helen agrees with me, you have to have an imagination that you create a lot of things that perhaps never happened in the world and couldn't happen, but you create those experiences and you put them into writing and you develop them. I found the more that I wrote, the more I attempted to create a character and then opposite characters of my primary. Your imagination can really get carried away with you, and consequently, that's why I've ended up with all these novels flying around. Was just the fact that there are people out there, there are real people that are really spies, and I knew that to be a fact. I knew it when I was over there. I had people on my tail all the time. I was in the 5 years or so I was in Russia, and so I just began to develop around Sasha, making my primary character. He went through all sorts of experiences, iterations, attempted assassinations on his part and what have you. And then it just caught on. And once I finished a novel, I would, such as Requiem of a Spy, that's a spy by the name of Sasha that was a spy, grew out of it, and then grew back into it again. And it's been a very popular book. I've had several hits on it from others that want to do more than just read it. But I did have an offer, and I still have it on paper from a Hollywood producer that wants to do something with it at some time. But I don't know. I don't put a lot of thought into those. They make an offer, and you let it, everybody signs a paper. You put it in your file cabinet, and that's usually where it stays. But I really became infatuated with it. In fact, I just published another one just recently. I think it's number 15 or 16 of my novel series. And they're all different. They come up with different creativity, different thought processes, different suspicions that you might have had at what took place and what have you. I went to Russia out of the Air Force, long since retired out of that, 7 or 8 years, I guess, when I was offered this opportunity to go over there and help supervise a recovery project with their communication systems. And I wasn't at all leery about going, about being trailed or followed or what have you, as you are now. I wouldn't dare go there today. You'd end up with a 10-year sentence or something, somebody trying to bail you out. But at any rate, that's the source of my novels.
You
I didn't know
also,
my mind was that creative as a kid from where I came from down in South Texas. But anyway, it became a hobby, and I've had a lot of fun with it. And
well, I know you wrote, Chris, I know you wrote a book. Yes.
Stories to go with it. So that's sort of it on the novel side. And you've seen some of them and understand.
Well, Chris, you also wrote a follow-up book called Deterrence. That follow-up book referenced to Sasha, and it brings, carried the story forward in that particular, Deterrence. Yes, you carried that forward in the book. And your ideologies, and this is where you wrote in nonfiction, your ideologies in conflict was nonfiction. So it's what you just said about Tom Clancy, I think, is very important. This is a man that was loved by millions around the world, and he had so much experience with interacting with generals, people of different positionings in the military. And of course, they would sit, have conversations, and I'm sure he was like a sponge. He did all kinds of research. And when he brought out his books, it was said that he was investigated because he was so astute in his evaluations about the potentiality of certain conditions and certain situations that were going to be evolving. And this is something that when he gave you that advice, when he gave you that insight, it really changed the way you thought. And one of the things that I think is so significant about this is that it's good for us to ask questions. If we're writers and we're wanting to put out a publication, we're doing something, we need, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, we're going to be doing research. We're going to be looking at various activities and points of information. And when you're writing nonfiction, you can put a lot of fact in, you can add a little imagination, but you can put a lot of facts in there. And it's amazing how people will pick up on that. They will pick up on those facts. They will even check things out, even though it's in a fictitious format. But it is absolutely fascinating what you have been able to do, you and Helena both. And I want to ask you the same question that I asked Helena. What was it that motivated you to start writing? What was it that motivated you to get into writing down your experiences instead of just quietly retiring and really not being concerned about too much of anything? Why did you feel you had to write the stories?
Well, when I retired, so to speak, I claim to have retired 3 times and failed all 3 times. And so having dinner one night with some friends here in Texas, and people asked questions, always they knew that I'd been in Russia. They knew I'd done this, done that, and asked a lot of questions. And said, Chris, why don't you put some of that in writing sometime? And I said, I can't write. I'm a high school graduate from a little town in Texas. I'm not a writer. I said, yeah, but you've been experienced to it. You've seen it, you've read it, and what have you. And so that's when I went back, as I mentioned a moment ago, and wrote this little 200-pager Inside the Cold War, a Cold Warrior's Reflections. And by that, I meant I had been there, of course, in Vietnam for a couple of tours, and then was blessed by going to Russia for sure and meeting Russians firsthand, meeting the mayors of four of the Russian cities at the time. Happened to be in a room one night or one day for a meeting, which I did not realize later that Vladimir Putin was standing right next to me with four other associate mayors with the of Petersburg. And nobody knew Vladimir Putin at that time, much less myself. And it dawned on me later, and I guess a year or two later, that was him there in the meeting at the time, and was standing as one of the vice mayors of Mayor Gubshov of St. Petersburg. And so those things begin to flow out of your mind, and you become a little bit more creative and say, gee, I didn't know that. I didn't know I did that. And but with regard to writing itself, I knew a lot, I learned a lot, I found out a lot, I was experienced a lot, I met a lot of people that shared things with me. And then the meeting I had with Tom Clancy that evening really stirred me up to do more than just writing a documentary about what I know, where I'd been and who I had met, and began to attempt to be creative. My books are just books. They all range 250, 300 pages, and they're novels, they're stories that I make up myself. And therefore, they don't have a lot of ribbons or medals attached to them. They're just basic, fundamental novels, stories. But I have a lot of attention given to them, of course. That makes you feel good. That works on the ego to go do some more. And so that's where I am with it. And that's how I really got started, by being encouraged to write. I met a lot of people, and occasionally in a conversation, you may mention something, as I did one night in a dinner party. And I mentioned that I had bumped into Ross Perot one evening and had a very good conversation with Ross, who was at the time very much involved in the military, wanting to do more with it, being an ex-Navy guy not. And one of the ladies in the little group, there were about 6 or 7, sort of popped out, "Name dropper." Well, that hit me like a rock in the head, and I said, well, I guess I am, so I've been very careful not to drop names when I meet people, although it's very difficult not to drop names. If you've been around some people, you're impressed by them, and the fact that you had the privilege or the opportunity to visit with them, be with them, get to know them, and what have you. And I've been very blessed with those opportunities by virtue of either accident or incident, mostly, and what have you. So the writing part of it has just evolved out of that, of experiences and opportunities to see people, meet people, and sit back in many cases and just observe what's going on, and then take those observations, whether they're true or expanded truth or not, expand them into your own novel, or your own story, I should say.
Helena, with your writing, when you wrote some books about women and pilots, being pilots, to me it has been so fascinating as I've become more educated, as time has gone on, and with so many different publications like yours that I have the good fortune to be able to be made aware of. It opens up a whole panorama of information that I think many of the younger generation just do not have any idea about. They look at their world today, which is normal. They see what they see. They're not aware of what it took on the part of men and women, both, to evolve to where it took their decisions, their willingness to be the pioneers, especially the women, in flying and being able to do what they need to do. And as I said earlier, the English didn't have a problem having women pilots because they found after World War I they didn't have enough men to do that. So many of the English men died in the First World War. So they started allowing women in at the end of that war. When the Second World War started up, it was like they get equal pay. They were able to have responsible positionings. All of this you bring out in your books, that you show the different time spectrums that evolved. And then the U.S., we were like snails. It took us forever to make it okay for women to not only fly And I had the good fortune of knowing a woman, Dorothy Olson, and she's gone now. But she was part of the, I wanted to say, the WASPs. Were they the pilots or which?
Yeah.
Okay.
Women's Air Force Service pilots, yes, WASP.
And the only
Correct.
thing she was allowed to do, and she flew, and she was a little bitty squirt. She was a little tiny gal, but she flew the transport planes and things, but they were only allowed to fly in the United States. She was not allowed to go overseas, you know, to fly. So here we look at women flying jets today and looking at all of this, and you have covered so much of this in your material, which I think is fabulous, because most young people today have no idea what their grandmothers, their great-grandmothers, and in some cases their great-great-grandmothers, what they went through. It's really, that had to have been a very exciting arena for you to do research on and to get into.
Okay, Donna, I've come from a very different point than Chris. Chris had this incredible life, an incredible career. They're doing this and meeting these people. I don't have that. I'm somebody who started, I say, with 4. I got the writing bug. I wanted to write. I wanted to put myself in other people's shoes. And I have devoted, okay, so I'm getting, I have devoted my writing career to trying to remember others, so that whereas Chris says he can take out of his own experience and create characters, I have always felt that I'm not creating characters, that people who have gone before me are using me as a medium to tell their stories. So same's true of these women. And it was most particularly intense for me in the case of Kit Moran, but that ultimately I run into something, and then it's like, if I say it's hearing voices, people think I'm Joan of Arc or something. It's not that, but something will cause me to start looking into something more deeply and researching, and I start digging, and I go down that rabbit hole, etc. Ultimately, because it's the people, as you're saying, it's the people who have gone before us. It's the people who achieved things that we've forgotten. I'd want them to be remembered again. My books are memorials. My books are tribute to other people, not myself. I haven't done anything particular. I had a very good solid career in the Foreign Service. Good. Okay, fine. I didn't do anything spectacular. I didn't meet presidents. I didn't meet Putin. I didn't do anything outstanding. But I hope that I have developed a skill in writing that allows me to be the face to be the of others. And so every book, those women pilots, yes, they attracted me. As we can go back, every single book that I'm writing, I'm ultimately trying to give voice to people who I think made major contributions to world history and have been forgotten in the meantime.
When you're saying that, I feel that is very true. In every one of your books that I have interviewed you on my shows, there is always that very strong sense of this person, that person. For example, with the planes, when we go into the discussion about the mechanics, that is mind-boggling to me, because my understanding and capability of working in any form of mechanics is like a minus 55 to, it's not there. That's just not me. It's not in my head at all. But you will describe the planes. You will describe the way the mechanics had to work. There is so much there that's the human experience, what the women and the men had to go through to cope with various environments, what it takes to have an airfield. I had no idea that for planes to land, you had to have a particular texture on that landing strip, because you've got tonnage of materials. And that brings me in to your book on the Berlin airlift, because you obtained so much information and how various environments that often would have been very competitive with each other gathered together and said, we're going to make a difference. And the Berlin airlift was such an incredible accomplishment. And it was an international accomplishment at a time when getting parts for planes, mechanics. I remember talking to some young guy in a museum, an air museum in Medford, Oregon. And I was down there and I was admiring this engine that looked like a work of art to me. I didn't understand what any of the parts were, but I didn't need to. It was beautiful. It was polished. It looked gorgeous. And this young man walked up and he had his son with him. He said, you know, my dad was a mechanic and he knew that engine. He knew it inside and out. And he said, do you know? And he started talking to me. I'm nobody. I'm just standing there. He doesn't know anything about me. Talking about a silly engine, but it's gorgeous. And I said, well, you know, I think it's a work of art. He said, it really is. He said, do you know my dad sometimes had to put things together with wire and other materials that nobody had any idea that they could utilize to repair because the plane had to land and they had to get it back up in the air right away? And you forget. People don't think about that in today's world. When they go to the airport, they don't think about all the people, the thousands of people that are behind the scenes that enable them not only to get on a plane that is usually extraordinarily safe, it's safer on the plane than it is on the freeway. And you are on that plane, your luggage being taken care of, all kinds of materials available to people, food being brought in, all of these things. And when you go back, and that is what you bring out in your publication on the Berlin airlift, that I think is so significant because you get behind the scenes, and that's something that you like to do in your writing. And with that book, when you put that book out, and that's about the candy bomber, the soldier, but when that came out, and the stories about the children, and how the Russians, you know, prevented, I mean, all of the critical information politically even that you put in, all of that brings an awareness to where we are today. And yes, the wall came down, but look at how long that wall was up and what these people had to go through in the interim. This is a phenomenal book because it brings us forward into the Cold War. Was this an emotional rite for you when you were doing the Berlin airlift of 1948 to 1949? Was that an emotional rite for you?
All my books are emotional, Donna. If I'm not emotionally engaged on a topic, I don't write it. It's just that. I don't need to write. I've actually earned my money. I have a pension from my day job. The book I write out of passion, and I write because that topic attracts me, and as I say, and the people involved in it attract me, and I write their stories for them. And whether I do that in nonfiction or fictional form, it's because I'm attracted. If the nonfiction normally comes first in a way, because the nonfiction becomes the basis of the fiction. So if the nonfiction is like getting basic fact, right, as I was talking about, that outline the time, you know, all of the, you know, the major characters, and you know what happens, you know what the chronology is, you know everything. And then you can, once you have that, then you can start going beyond the mere facts and dig into the psychological and social aspects of an issue. So for me, Blockade Breakers, what you're saying, which I loved writing. It was great fun because I wrote it back in 2008. There were still a lot of veterans. I went to some of the veterans meetings. I was at Cella, and you will not believe, a bunch of old geezers sitting around me, telling me their stories, all the things that are not fit to print about the Berlin area. It was marvelous. And you're sitting there saying, wow, this is material for 1,000 novels. These are so many stories here. And that was just the flyer side. As you've mentioned, there's also the annex, also the Berliner side. You know, there's very much two sides to the Berlin airlift. There's the people who are the actual victims who are actually under siege, and then the people who are trying to help them. And they had been former enemies. I mean, that's one of the things I really stress, that heroes of my Bridge to Tomorrow series, as I stress, is, you know, J.B. Kit Moran dropped high explosives on Berlin. Now they're flying children's shoes. And that's it.
Well, I think it's a phenomenal publication. Now, it leads into the Cold War because after, you know, this is something, the Cold War started evolving. Now, for a lot of younger people, they'll say, well, what's the Cold War? We're not having classes in history as we used to have, so a lot of young people have no association with this at all, where mature generations do. They have the memory of that. But when it came to the Cold War, that was a positioning that did evolve out of the Second World War, creating the division between the United States and Russia. And the German people were going through a lot of shifts and changes, obviously, because Germany was, for all intents and purposes, it was just devastated with all of the bombings. So much was just gone. I've had friends that survived that period, and interestingly enough, they ended up making it here to the United States. But it was a very, very difficult period for people, very difficult period for people. So with the Cold War, and that is what your trilogy that you're putting out, you've got book number 3 out, but that's going to be coming out, excuse me. But the evolution into the Cold War, that went on for, that was, we still are in it to a degree. That was quite a long period that evolved up into the 50s and even was still going on in the 60s. I mean, we're looking at something that, it was just like watching a soap opera. You go from this particular series, and now you've got this new series of experiences and interactions that evolve. And there were so many changes that occurred so quickly with the men and the women in not just the United States, but in Britain, in France, and in Russia. There was just so much that evolved after that. That has been quite a commitment on your part. And you wrote 3 series. Tell us about the three books. The 3rd book is not ready yet. That's going to be coming out. But 1 and 2, and you centered it around some very, very special people. But again, you've got all of these different characters that are in there. And it's wonderful. You have this following through. So tell us about that quickly.
Oh, right. Hopefully the internet doesn't go. Okay, basically the trilogy is devised as the book 1, Cold Peace, basically into the characters and the themes, and basically sets that post-war environment. The United States and the Soviet Union are still allies. Germany is the enemy. The Soviet Union and the United States are occupiers in Germany. But the tensions between the United States and between Great Britain and the Soviet Union are growing. So that first Cold Peace describes the post-war, the lack of progress, the fact that Germany, Clay has to go before Congress and say the United States flag should not fly over a country where children are starving. Germany is on the brink of collapse because the Soviet Union is blocking all efforts of the West to revive the economy. So Cold Peace sets up the environment, and it ends where the Soviets instituted the western sector, and cutting 2.5 million people off from all sources of food, medicine, milk, everything, and energy, which is incredibly important. The electricity in West Berlin was coal-fired. Coal came from the east. So that by cutting off the coal supplies and cutting off electricity supply, people didn't have transportation. They didn't have public transportation, trams and underground. They didn't have, the sewage systems wouldn't work. The electricity systems didn't work. The water, nothing works without electricity. So that the Allies have to fly in not only food, but coal, which is very heavy, a major factor in the Berlin area. Book 2 looks at that enormous logistical achievement that the Western Allies, with nothing, United States, the French stay out of it, Frank. It's the British and the United States take over the burden of trying to feed and keep the West Berliners supplied by air alone, by flying them in on little propeller planes. They started with the two-engine Dakotas, and then they finally get more and more of the larger planes. But it's always, by our standards, tiny little planes. The maximum any of these planes could carry, the Globemaster could take 24 tons. But they didn't have enough of them to really deploy it, and it required long runways, which they didn't have. So the workhorses were carried 10 tons of C-54, and the Yorks. And the British also had to bring in liquid fuel because the Americans had no capacity for liquid fuel. The British also took up the burden of taking people out. But so that's described in Book 2, Cold War, and it describes literally how the West is going about trying to save Berlin. The shift of attitudes from being enemies of the Germans to starting to be allies with the Germans. And the 3rd book, Cold Victory, which is the one I'm working on but won't be released until the next year, basically says, okay, the airlift starts to succeed. It almost collapses in November. So that's the 2nd book ends with the airlift basically goes down. The planes are not coming in. The fog has closed every airport, and they're running out of food in Berlin. The 3rd book picks up from there. The weather backs off. They manage to start getting, and then they're ramping up this airlift. But the price is that the division of Germany, the division of Europe, and the start of the Cold War. Because okay, the West wins that first battle in Berlin, that immediate conflict, the Russians end up backing down, but they only back off in Berlin. They don't surrender. They just start making trouble somewhere else. Like Chris can tell me, it doesn't. They win this tactical battle, but they haven't won the war. We don't win the Cold War until the Soviet Union collapses, 1990, whatever, which is, I would say, 50 years after the end of the Berlin crisis. So the Bridge to Tomorrow talks about is the title is Bridge from the old regime, which was World War II. We were allies with the Soviet Union, to the future, which is where we're enemies with the Soviet Union, gridlocked in a Cold War with them. And the Berlin crisis is that transition period. Those 18 months is where we change from being the enemies of Germany and the allies of the Soviet Union to being allies with Germany and the enemies of the Soviet Union. And it's described, as I say, in these three pieces: Cold Peace, which is more about the post-war era, and Cold Victory, which focuses more to a Cold War era. As the first one's called the World War II era, the final one's more the Cold War, and the central book, which has just come out, Cold War, describes the logistical, political, achievements, the very, very intense and very exciting things that went on to make that happen.
I'm really looking forward to book number 3 when you were able to get that to me. I really, really am, because I so enjoyed the first two. Chris Adams, I really feel that you have such a different perspective, Chris, because you were in the Strategic Air Command. And this was something that was a tremendous responsibility for you. There were, I don't know how many people that were under you that were on a high alert frequently because of what was happening in Russia. The Cold War was and still is going on. We still have so much that evolved, but during the time frame that you experienced with that, there had to have been some really, really scary moments for you as a responsible officer, and you having to work with so many other people. There was always that, are we going to end up going to war feeling? That had to have been something that for all of you kept you on edge most of the time. What was that like for you working with the Strategic Air Command?
I'm sorry, I missed that question. You're coming in very, very low.
What was it like for you working with the Strategic Air Command during the Cold War? Because we're still in it, aren't we?
Well, yes, we are. I spent 6 years flying the ancient old B-36 bomber as a young officer, crew member, and performing alert most of the time. At least a third of our time was on alert. That is, loaded with nuclear weapons, sitting where we were sitting, and waiting for the, as they say, the balloon to go up. Transitioned that into B-52s then for another 4 years. And so I spent, 10 years as a combat crew member on 2 different bombers with a lot of people, a lot of incredibly bright young folks. And as Helen spoke to the young women in there, we didn't have them as crew members at the time. They came later. And I had the opportunity to fly with a lot of young ladies later on in post-Cold War era, flying the Boeing 707 and others, which was really very impressive. Some very bright, sharp, and now as the information is out there about the young ladies now, making flag officer general and moving right on up to a 3- and 4-star rank. Well, they don't do that by themselves. Most all of them are aviators and accomplished aviators, and done a great job. They're were really fun to fly with. They were intelligent. You could sit on the jump seat and behind a young captain landing a Boeing 707 or 137, and just very impressed. I mean, professional all the way through. And of course, now they're into the commercial airliners, what have you. But back in the alert days, we didn't have the young women there. We had a few that worked in maintenance and what have you, maybe a few in communications, but they did not perform or were not asked to perform as a combat crew member. So we didn't really get to know them then back in, I'll say, in the 50s or 60s on into the 70s, as we do now. They're very accomplished. Those that I have had the opportunity to work with in the latter days and what have you are very good. I flew one night on the Looking Glass, which was the SAC Airborne Command Post when I was still in SAC headquarters, and a young captain named Smith, I'll never forget, we called her Smitty. She was the co-pilot on the crew with a young major as the aircraft commander. And as a flag officer, a general officer, you flew along for the ride, unless you were a rated officer and asked to fly the airplane, which I did every time. I said, can I make the takeoff and landing? And of course, the IP instructor pilot said, yes, sir, you sure can. And so we're flying this one night, and I made the takeoff. We flew our 8-hour sortie on Looking Glass, the airborne command post, and decided to come in and land. And I said, well, I told the young major in charge, I said, let Smitty make the landing this time. I mean, it's her turn. So she climbed into the left seat in the aircraft commander's seat, and I sat on the jump seat behind her and watched intently how she handled herself, and she was good. And the funny part was we landed back at Omaha, Nebraska, off at Air Force Base. She made a beautiful landing, made the approach, and beautiful landing. This is a Boeing 707 now, 4-engine jet. And she was very nervous. I know she was. I made her nervous just being sitting behind her, looking over her shoulder. And we were taxiing in, and the guys were out there with the flags, waving to guiding her in, and she made a left turn into the wrong area, wrong alley to take that 707. And she recognized the guy held up his batons at XX, stop. She slammed on the brakes. She looked back over her shoulder and said, "Oh, poop." Everybody got a kick out of that and said, well, that's fine. But she finished up and went on in, and I understand she's probably still out there somewhere flying. But they had, the young gals, young women had a lot of jokes made about them at the time, as far as Helen knows. They weren't, accepted as full-blown aviators back in I would say in the 70s, 60s, 70s, on the 80s now, and they've proven themselves, incredibly so, and become just as competent, if not more so in many cases, because women are more detailed and specific, but they are. And I'm looking forward to reading some of your material, because it'll be interesting from my elementary point of view of making observations to what you have observed and captured in print. So I look forward to that, Helen.
Well, Chris and Helena, this has just been a wonderful hour with you, and I've got the books on display here, so I'm hoping that we'll get a good camera shot so people will see some of your publications. And we couldn't put them all out. I'd have to have, a whole platform to display them, but they can go to your website. It will be listed in the credits so that they will know how they can get in touch with you. But I want you to both know, Helena, you're in Greece. You are in Greece, and it just thrills me that we've been able to connect by phone, but this is the first time we've had face-to-face. Chris, you're in Austin, Texas, and it's the same thing. We have had many conversations during these last 10 years, and it's just been wonderful to have both of you on the show. And I think, if nothing else, it gives us an understanding how important it is, number one, to tell our stories, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, but number two, to always realize that people are who we're trying to communicate with, and it's people that we write about, and it's what life is all about. And history is so very important. It is so very important. I want to thank both of you for being my guests. And for those of you that are with me during this program, I'm so glad you've joined me, and won't you share the information with your other friends? You can go to DelphiInternational.com, the Donna Sebo Network. All of the information is there for you as well. Remember, who you are makes a difference. What you experience in life makes a difference, but it's also what you do with your life that makes a difference as well. I'm so glad that you've joined me. I hope that you will, stay tuned for some of the other programs. This is Donna Sebo with the special editions. Bye for now.
You have been listening to the Donna Sebo Show special editions. The audio version of this program will also be heard on the Donna Sebo Show radio broadcast. We are delighted you were able to join us and invite you to share this programming with your friends and family. Have a rich and fulfilling life.